The exposure metering modes determine how the camera sets exposure. There are 3 modes. Color Matrix 2. This looks at the entire image within the frame to determine proper exposure. This works best with CPU lenses. 3D Color Matrix 2 metering is used. This is a sophisticated overall metering system. Center weighted metering. In this mode, the camera looks at the entire frame's needs, but mostly weighs the center portion of the frame to make its final determination. Spot meter. This looks at the center 2% of the frame to determine exposure needs at that precise point. This is great for determining exposure differences between different parts of the subject or scene. Before we discuss the exposure modes of the D200, we'll review some basics of exposure in case that added context might be helpful. Let's start with an analogy. Consider the proper amount of light or exposure to be like a full bucket of water. Then consider a water tap from which you will fill the bucket to be the aperture or opening on your lens. Finally, consider your camera's shutter speed to be like the amount of time you will leave the water tap turned on. The more the tap is opened, the more water will come through the hose into the bucket, and hence the shorter amount of time you will need the tap to be open. Conversely, if the tap will only open a small amount and water is only trickling into the bucket, you'll need to leave the water turned on for a much longer period of time. An interesting and important note is that shutter speed not only affects exposure, but it also affects clarity during action. A fast shutter speed will freeze a moving subject in your picture, whereas a slow shutter speed will appear to blur a moving object. Fast shutter speeds are therefore useful for taking pictures of sporting events. Slow shutter speeds are useful for taking pictures of waterfalls or car lights at night, giving a very interesting image. Just as important to understand are the secondary effects of aperture. A small aperture not only lets less light reach the image sensor, tending to make a darker exposure, but it also makes the entire scene from near to far appear more sharp or in focus. This optical phenomenon is called a long depth of field. This is useful when photographing a subject in front of a national monument where you want both in focus. A large aperture has the opposite effect. Only the subject of focus will be in focus. This is used extensively in portrait photography as it helps to literally focus attention on the subject. Let's look briefly at one more photographic concept: aperture and shutter stop. Both shutter speeds and apertures have a standard series of settings called stops. Opening the aperture by one stop will double the light that reaches the sensor. Similarly, speeding the shutter by one stop will half the light that reaches the sensor. Therefore, by opening the aperture one stop and speeding the shutter by one stop, the exposure is kept constant. By opening the aperture 2 or 3 stops and speeding the shutter 2 or 3 will have the same effect on exposure. It will not change. Thus, the amount of light that reaches the sensor will remain constant. Your pictures will be just as light or dark as they were before. What does change? The depth of field and the subject's motion, frozen or blurred.